But I'd like to hand over to our next speaker, Alistair McNaught from GIST TechDisc. He's going to give us a rather different viewpoint. Thank you, Alistair.
Thank you, Sarah. Interestingly, it's going to be a very similar viewpoint, but from a very different angle. I've called this one Through the Looking Glass. How many of you are familiar with Alice in Wonderland? Can I just show of hands? Okay, quite a lot of you. You may remember that in the book Through the Looking Glass, Alice at one time is having a conversation with a white queen, and the white queen says something that's completely impossible, and Alice challenges her. And the White Queen says, "In my youth, I used to believe 6 impossible things before breakfast, and I encourage you to do the same." And that's what I want to talk about this afternoon. 6 impossible things before breakfast, really. For example, if we were to think about a blind dentist, how many of you would go to a blind dentist? Nope. So this is a real-life example. It's a student wanting to study dentistry, and he's blind. There's going to be all sorts of challenges there. Is that an impossible thing to do? Is that a sensible thing to do? Actually, as it happened, the dentistry department took him on because he didn't want to be a practicing dentist. He wanted to be a dental researcher. And that, of course, opens up a whole new world. And a person who's blind is perfectly capable of studying anything, but there's another impossibility layer that's coming in, which is, how do I access some of these science, some of the symbols? Is it possible for a blind person to study high-level maths, for example, where everything is symbolic, or to study engineering with all the sorts of diagrams that you have to understand, and vector diagrams, and so on? Well, let's just have a look at that, because science is full, the annals of science are full of people who have achieved remarkable things because they thought in completely different ways. And that's no less true when it comes to the world of disability and access. So we have here Michael Faraday, who nowadays we would describe Michael Faraday as a dyslexic. We have Leonard Euler, who produced some 50% or so of his prodigious output as a mathematician after he was completely blind. Leonardo da Vinci, who again, nowadays we would probably describe him as being dyslexic, says that you should prefer a good scientist without literary abilities than a literate one without scientific skills. And sometimes these alternative ways of thinking are actually part and parcel of the kinds of contributions these folk can make to science and technology and mechanics and engineering and so on. So Bernard Maureen, who was completely blind, was the first person to demonstrate mathematically how a eversion of a sphere takes place, how you can turn a sphere inside out. And when people were talking to him about it, he didn't perceive a sphere the way you or I would perceive a sphere, which is looking at the outside. He had a sense of a sphere being something that has an inside as well, because he was not distracted by the visual appearance of things. So there are all sorts of ways of alternative thinking. There are all sorts of amazing breakthroughs in maths and science that owe their very existence to the kind of characters that were involved. However, here's a couple more, and I'm not going to go into this because this isn't really about telling you how blind people and dyslexic people and so on can access science, technology and maths. It's really about saying, what are the barriers? Why are we not getting more blind people, blind students? If you look at the percentage of blind students that go on to study STEM subjects compared to the percentage of non-blind students that go on to study STEM subjects, there is a huge drop-off rate. So why is it, and what can you do about it? Sarah talked earlier about the 1 in 5 people with a print impairment of some kind. That's the population of China. So just think of it in those terms. Would you decide not to go into a market that was going to involve selling to China? Probably not. So let's talk then about the sorts of things that will make a difference and that will allow these impossible things to actually be very possible. Just in very simple terms, I'm going to look at some practical things and I'm going to look at some policy things. In terms of practice, let's start off just looking at the description of images, ensuring that images are properly described. This is one of my favourite kind of pictures. This is from no, I better not tell you where it's from because some of you may be publishing in this area. But this is a manual that helps you take cars apart and put them back together. And I always struggled with mending my car because I could never make sense of what the picture was showing me, okay? And that's not me as a blind person thinking, there's a picture here and I can't make sense of it. Any improvements that you make in terms of image description will not only benefit blind users, they will benefit all kinds of users. A really effective image description benefits everybody. Another way of making a difference in practice is to make sure that when you're using symbols and formulae, you're using MathML. Now, I guess in a conference like this, there's probably quite a lot. Can I see how many people here do use MathML for all images in their publications? Okay, that's very helpful, and congratulations to you that do. There's quite a few that didn't, apparently. The problem with inline images, of course, is that an inline image cannot tell you anything other than any description that's associated with it. If I'm not blind, but I am visually impaired, and I just need to increase the magnification, I get the sort of pixelation you see down the bottom with an inline image. Whereas, obviously, with MathML, I can enlarge as I wish, and I get some real benefits. It's still clear, it's still crisp, and there are some even better things, because I can, in theory, get it to talk to me. In terms of policy, so we've looked at practice, we'll look at some policy. There needs to be a sense of who is responsible for certain things. This ties back to some of the things Hendrik was talking earlier about this. What do you allow authors to do? What do you encourage authors to do? But I'm just going to go one step before that for a moment. I'm just going to ask you again, can you just, quick show of hands, how many of you know that there is a person in your organisation who has responsibility for accessibility? Can you put your hand up if you know there is a person that does that and you could kind of give a name? Okay, that's an interestingly small number when you look around. Because if you don't have somebody within your organisation that is taking a lead on that and that has a responsibility, the chances of you actually making any changes are extremely remote. If you had nobody that was in charge of HR, what would your personnel be like? If you had nobody that was in charge of finance, what would your budgets be like? If you have nobody in charge of accessibility, then you can guess what that is going to mean, what that impact is. And that becomes really significant. I'm not going to tell you why straight away, but I will in a moment. It becomes really significant. Particularly looking at some of the figures that Jake was showing us earlier. So that's something for you to reflect on. Do we have someone? If we do, then why don't I know about it? You know, it's obviously not being marketed internally very well. But simple questions like, do you have a policy on who it is in your publications that is responsible for identifying heading levels, structural navigation, etc.? Well, you may very well have that done at various stages in the production by all sorts of people. But of course, the real semantic intelligence is probably inherent with the author. It probably lies with the author. In terms of describing the images of the graphs, probably the best person who can give you an alternative description to a complex image is the person that decided why they wanted that image in there in the first place rather than another image. And just while I'm on that thing of complex images, because in this area of work there are some incredibly complex images that you can't easily explain in a sentence. Nature Publishing has a really nice policy with this, at least somebody in Nature Publishing was telling me about this a couple of years ago when we were talking about this. If they've got particularly complex images that defy simple description, they give you a contact person that you can contact who can then, on an individual basis, talk through what that image is about. So for a visually impaired person, they can get almost a personalized conversation, be it on email or be it on telephone, to say, this is what this is really about, this is what that graph is showing. Now, that's not necessarily a big overhead, because the number of completely blind people accessing these STEM subjects is still relatively small. So just interesting, very practical ways of making a policy work. Now, the really critical bit, I said I'd come in a moment to the bit that really matters, because you could easily sit there, and I wouldn't blame you for sitting there saying, well, I'm not really interested in this, because actually it's such a tiny part of our business. How many blind people are we going to have who want to use our resources? It's not relevant to me. Okay, I can understand that, but it is relevant to you when you begin to look at Jake's figures earlier. 97% of that first pie chart that Jake showed us was showing that 97% of the subscribers he was working with, to the journals he was working with, 97% were institutions. Now, I don't know what it's like in all other countries, but in the UK, there is something called the Equalities Act. The Equalities Act 2010 actually puts an obligation on all learning providers to make sure that their information is provided in an accessible format. What that means is if I am in a library service and I'm thinking about the journals that I'm going to renew next year, one of the questions that are increasingly being asked by library services, and one of the questions that our organisation, JISC TechDis and others, are encouraging them to ask is, okay, tell me about the accessibility, because basically for every book that I get from your collection, a textbook that you give me, if it can't be accessed by a visually impaired person or a dyslexic person that needs it in a particular format, I have to go and do that manually. If I have to do that manually, work by colleagues at the University of Aberdeen suggested that it's about £600 to make an inaccessible textbook accessible. If you can save me £600 every time I have to do that, and if you can allow me to put on my equalities statement and my equalities policy, we procure from accessible publishing platforms, learning platforms, software platforms, etc., that is going to make a big difference, okay, to me. Not, irrespective of the fact I may only have 5 visually impaired learners, I don't want to take the risk of one of those 5 visually impaired learners trying to do a science subject and having to give up because I procured something unwisely. So, this is my supply chain on the screen here. My learner needs your content. My organisation's legally obliged to provide it accessibly. Tutors ask me to pay a licence for this, and it uses this particular delivery system to give a learner direct access to the content you provided. If it doesn't work, then I need to start asking questions, because somebody's got to pick up that bill. Okay, now, in some ways, I'm putting a little bit of pressure on in talking about those things. Okay, I don't apologise for that, because I think these are things that it's important for you to be aware of, selling into this market. However, one of the things I want you also to be aware of is that sometimes, when we went around the room, there were quite a few people that were able to say, yes, we do this, yes, we mark up images and so on. But the point is, you also have vulnerabilities, because when Sarah talked about the supply chain and the joint statement of getting people to sign up to that, it's because sometimes you might have really accessible publishing, and yet by the time that your content is delivered through another platform, be it a browser or be it a bespoke learning platform or delivery system, you may find that all that brilliant accessibility's been completely undermined by the system itself. So, I've got 3 screenshots here of just a very simple formula in MathML. Now, I think probably a lot of people here like MathML for publishing. The first one is showing that simple formula in Firefox. It works beautifully. I'm showing that formula in the middle, Internet Explorer version 11. It completely scrambles the formula. Google Chrome, much the same. So, very variable rendering of content that inherently is accessible. Is the hope, is it hopeless? Well, the Internet Explorer story is quite interesting because you can not only render content really well with Internet Explorer, but you can even have it speak to you if you download a plugin called MathPlayer. Now, the problem is, although MathPlayer speaks the expression, speaks MathML very happily, there are one or two problems because Internet Explorer 10 and Internet Explorer 11 are no longer compatible with MathPlayer. And so all that MathML you put in there can't actually be used. And because Windows 8 will only work on IE 10 and above, you can't use any MathML in an effective way on a browser on a Windows 8 machine. That's a bit sad. We could ask, will tablets and e-readers save us? What about, the fact that people will increasingly consume content on another device? Well, in some respects, Safari works really nicely on an iPad. That's that same formula there. But when I try to use it with VoiceOver, when I get to the equation, it just says unpronounceable characters, which was actually the very useful bit of the entire page, was those unpronounceable characters. What about Mathjax? And again, this will be too technical for some, it'll be far too untechnical for others. I know we've a mixed audience. Mathjax actually works really nicely. There's those three browsers again, and using Mathjax instead of MathML, what do I get? Beautiful rendering across those three browsers. But Mathjax will only be accessible to text-to-speech for a blind person, for example, through MathPlayer. See previous comments. MathPlayer doesn't work on Internet Explorer 10 and 11. So, there are two take-home messages that I have. If this is new to you, and from the show of hands, for some of you, maybe for quite a lot of you, some of these issues are not on the radar particularly. If it's new to you, then start somewhere by doing something practical, whether it's in terms of image descriptions, whether it's headings, structural semantic headings, whatever it is. Do something practical and tell customers why. That's really important because actually customers can be forgiving if you're not 100% accessible, okay? It's actually incredibly hard to be 100% accessible with anything other than telepathy. So customers are quite forgiving, but at least they need to be signposted as to what you have done and what things might create barriers so they can begin to anticipate how to mend them. If you are already doing good things, and again, a show of hands, a minority perhaps, but a show of hands still, people say, yes, we've got an accessibility person in the organization. Well, actually, that would be really good to have on some of your marketing. So also make sure that you engage with the partners, like the big vendors, the browser creators. Why is it that accessibility in browsers is currently being championed by small groups of open source developers and charitable people? Why isn't it major importance in Microsoft or in Google? So play that part in the supply chain, and also boast about your good practices, because soon, one day soon, it's going to be influencing purchasing decisions. And the last word from a dyslexic scientist: you won't get it all right in one go. You won't ever get it all right, because new opportunities will continue to evolve. New media will evolve as fast as you're being accessible with the old media. But I rather like this quote. President Wilson has blundered. Perhaps he has, but I notice he usually blunders forward. If you start to think about some of the impossible things you could do before breakfast, you won't get it all right all the time. You will probably make some blunders, but at least blunder forward.